The morning of November 23rd, 1943, North Africa. A captured German Kübelwagen sat in the testing yard at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, surrounded by American engineers holding clipboards and cameras. They had stripped it down, measured every component, analyzed every weld. The vehicle was light, clever, surprisingly capable off-road despite having only rear-wheel drive. The engineers documented everything in meticulous detail. Then one of them opened the glove compartment and pulled out the German manual. Technical Manual, Kraftfahrzeug, Type 82. Pages of diagrams, maintenance schedules, parts lists, standard military documentation. But as they translated it, something became clear. The Kübelwagen was not simple because German engineers lacked ambition. It was simple because they had designed it that way, intentionally eliminating complexity wherever possible. Limited slip differential, air-cooled engine, flat underbody that let it slide over, mud like a sled. A few weeks later, these same engineers received their own technical manual to review. TM 9-803, the complete maintenance guide for the Willys MB and Ford GPW, the American Jeep. As they laid the two manuals side by side, a profound realization emerged. The German manual was for a vehicle designed around constraint. The American manual was for a vehicle designed around abundance. This was the moment German engineering philosophy collided with American industrial reality. And in that collision lay one of the most overlooked truths of World War II. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what happened when German engineers first examined captured American Jeep manuals, we must first understand the world both vehicles were born into. In January 1938, the Wehrmacht approached Ferdinand Porsche with a request. They needed a light military vehicle, something that could move across European terrain, carry 4 soldiers, and operate reliably in winter conditions. But there was a catch. Germany's industrial capacity was limited. Raw materials were scarce. The vehicle had to be simple, lightweight, and easy to produce, without straining Germany's already stretched manufacturing base. Porsche took the civilian Volkswagen Beetle and adapted it for military use. The resulting Kübelwagen weighed just 725 kilograms, 300 kilograms lighter than what the Americans would eventually build. It had a tiny air-cooled engine producing just 22.5 horsepower. No radiator meant fewer parts to brake, less weight, and immunity to bullets-piercing cooling systems. The flat underbody allowed it to slide over terrain like a powered sled when the wheels sank into mud or snow. Most remarkably, it accomplished all of this with only rear-wheel drive. The Germans tested prototypes with 4-wheel drive, the Type 86, but concluded the added weight, complexity, and fuel consumption outweighed the benefits. Instead, they relied on reduction gears in the wheel hubs, a limited slip differential, and extremely light weight. In testing against 4-wheel drive vehicles, the Kübelwagen often outperformed them. It was engineering as philosophy. Do more with less. Eliminate every unnecessary gram. Accept limitations and work within them. Production began in February 1940 at Wolfsburg. By the time the war ended, Germany would produce 50,435 Kübelwagens. It was a respectable number, a good vehicle. German soldiers trusted it. It performed reliably from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen steppes of Russia. Then, on the other side of the Atlantic, a completely different philosophy was taking shape. In July 1940, the United States Army issued a requirement for a quarter-ton reconnaissance vehicle, 4-wheel drive, capable of carrying 5 men or 800 pounds of cargo. Maximum weight 2,600 pounds. Prototype to be delivered in 49 days. It was an impossible deadline. Most automotive companies dismissed the requirement entirely. Too complex, too fast, cannot be done. But the American Bantam Car Company in Butler, Pennsylvania, was desperate. They were on the verge of bankruptcy. Designer Karl Probst and his team worked through the night in a diner, sketching designs on napkins. They cobbled together a prototype from existing parts, invented new solutions for 4-wheel drive, and drove the finished vehicle from Pennsylvania to Maryland for testing. They made the deadline with hours to spare. The army loved it. But they had concerns. Could Bantam produce vehicles at the scale the military needed? The answer was no. So the army did something that would define the entire war effort. They took Probst's design, gave it to Willis Overland and Ford Motor Company, and told them to improve it and mass-produce it. Willis added a more powerful engine. 60 horsepower, nearly triple the Kübelwagen's output. Ford refined the front-end design, creating the flat hood and integrated headlights that became iconic. Then came standardization. Every bolt, every wire, every component built to exact specifications so that parts from Toledo could fit vehicles assembled in Detroit. A Willis MB and a Ford GPW were mechanically identical, interchangeable in every way. The scale of production was staggering. Ford's River Rouge plant in Detroit covered more than a square mile. It had its own steel mills, glass factories, and foundries. Raw iron ore entered at one end. Finished Jeeps rolled out the other. Willis's plant in Toledo operated around the clock. 3 shifts, 24 hours, no holidays. At peak production, a complete Jeep came off the assembly line every 80 seconds, 4 minutes from bare frame to finished vehicle. Women made up much of the workforce, stepping into industrial jobs while men fought overseas. They welded frames, installed engines, wired electrical systems. Every vehicle was tracked by serial number. Every defect was traced back to its source and corrected. This was not just manufacturing, it was industrial warfare. By mid-1942, both companies were producing Jeeps faster than they could be shipped overseas. Entire fleets sat waiting at ports, ready to cross the Atlantic. The first combat Jeeps arrived in North Africa just as American forces began engaging Rommel's Afrika Korps. Soldiers immediately recognized the vehicle's value. It could cross deserts, ford streams, climb mountain passes. Generals rode in them to observe front lines. Medics used them as ambulances. Artillery units towed guns with them. Radio operators carried communication gear in them. The Jeep became universal, indispensable. So common that German soldiers began to believe every American was issued their own vehicle. It seemed impossible. How could one nation produce so many machines? The answer lay in a fundamentally different approach to design. The Kübelwagen was optimized for scarcity. The Jeep was optimized for abundance. And that difference was about to become devastatingly clear. By late 1942, German forces had captured several intact American Jeeps, some from battlefield overruns in North Africa, others from supply convoys ambushed in Tunisia. Wehrmacht officers immediately claimed them as prizes. The Jeep's power, its four-wheel drive, its ability to carry heavy loads while maintaining speed, these were clear advantages over the Kübelwagen. But the real revelation came when German engineers got their hands on the technical manuals. TM9-803 for basic maintenance, TM9-1803A for the engine and clutch, TM9-1803B for the powertrain, body, frame, and special tools. Complete documentation, hundreds of pages, detailed exploded diagrams showing every component and how they fit together. The Germans studied these manuals with intense interest, and what they found shocked them. The American vehicle was not elegant, it was not minimalist, it was brutally straightforward, heavy, over-engineered in some places, unsophisticated in others. The engine was simple but powerful, the transmission was robust but not particularly clever, the suspension was effective but basic. But there was something else, something that took longer to understand. Every component in the Jeep was designed for replacement, not repair. Replacement. If something broke, you did not try to fix it in the field. You unbolted it and installed a new part. The manual assumed that spare parts would always be available, that supply lines would never run dry, that production could always provide more. This was the core assumption German engineers could not reconcile. Their entire design philosophy was built around scarcity: make things last, repair what breaks, conserve materials. The American philosophy was the opposite: make things simple enough to replace, produce so many spare parts that field repairs become trivial, overwhelm problems with industrial capacity. In November 1943, the United States War Department conducted thorough testing of captured Kübelwagens at Aberdeen Proving Ground. They published their findings in Technical Manual TME 9-803 on June 6, 1944, D-Day. The report was comprehensive and analytical. It documented the Kübelwagen's strengths: lightweight construction, effective use of reduction gears for off-road capability, air-cooled engine that worked in extreme temperatures, clever limited slip differential. But the conclusion was definitive. War Department Technical Manual TM-E 30-451, Handbook on German Military Forces, stated plainly on page 416, the Volkswagen, the German equivalent of the American Jeep, is inferior in every way except in the comfort of its seating accommodations. Inferior in every way. That assessment was not about clever engineering. The Kübelwagen was clever. It was about philosophy, about what each nation could bring to bear. The Germans had designed a vehicle that did more with less. The Americans had designed a vehicle that assumed more would always be available. Meanwhile, at British facilities, Humber Car Company engineers dissected another captured Kübelwagen. Their report was even more dismissive. It exhibited no special brilliance in design and should not be regarded as an example of first-class modern design to be copied by British industry. But these reports missed the point entirely. The Kübelwagen was not supposed to be copied. It could not be copied, because to build a Kübelwagen, you needed to think like Germany: constrained, clever, efficient, and by 1943, that was a losing strategy. The truth was simple and terrible. Germany had built exactly the vehicle it needed for the war it thought it would fight. Quick victory, limited resources, clever engineering triumphing over brute force. The United States had built exactly the vehicle it needed for the war it could actually win. Endless production, overwhelming logistics, the assumption that there would always be more. When German soldiers captured an American Jeep, they celebrated. Finally, a vehicle with real power, four-wheel drive, speed, durability. Wehrmacht generals admitted after the war that the Jeep was the piece of American equipment they most admired and most wanted to capture for their own use. But when German engineers studied the Jeep's manuals, they saw something more troubling. They saw an opponent who did not think in terms of constraints, who built vehicles assuming that steel, rubber, and fuel would never run out, who designed for replacement rather than repair because they could afford to produce infinite spare parts. The Jeep was not superior because of clever design. It was superior because of the industrial system that created it. And that system was something Germany could never match. This realization came too late. By the time Wehrmacht officers were translating American technical manuals, the outcome of the war was already determined. Not by tactics, not by bravery, not by superior tanks or aircraft, but by something far more fundamental: the capacity to produce, to ship, to supply, to replace, to overwhelm. The Germans had designed simplicity, born from necessity. The Americans had designed simplicity, born from abundance. And in total war, abundance always wins. By early 1944, the disparity was becoming impossible to ignore. German maintenance depots struggled with shortages of every kind: rubber for tires, steel for chassis repairs, fuel for testing. Mechanics learned to improvise, cannibalizing damaged Kübelwagens to keep others running. A broken axle might take weeks to replace. A damaged transmission could sideline a vehicle for months. American maintenance operations worked differently, entirely differently. When a Jeep broke down, mechanics consulted the technical manual, identified the failed component, and installed a replacement. The entire process might take an hour, 2 at most. The broken part was discarded, sent to the rear for potential salvage, but never allowed to delay operations. Supply sergeants maintained vast inventories: engines, transmissions, axles, carburetors, starters, every component stocked in quantity. When supplies ran low, requisition orders went back to the United States. Within weeks, sometimes days, ships arrived, carrying exactly what was needed, entire jeeps if necessary. Replacement was faster than repair. This abundance created a psychological effect that German soldiers found deeply unsettling. They destroyed an American jeep, only to see 3 more appear the next day. They captured a supply depot, inventoried the braid, spare parts, and realized they had found enough components to build dozens of vehicles from scratch. The Americans were not just winning, they were drowning the battlefield in material. Wehrmacht officers who interrogated captured American soldiers tried to understand this system. How did it work? Where did all these vehicles come from? The answers they received seemed impossible. Factories in Detroit and Toledo producing 1 jeep every 80 seconds, 637,770 vehicles built between 1941 and 1945. Nearly 200,000 shipped to Allied nations under Lend-Lease. The numbers were staggering, incomprehensible. The United States produced more military vehicles in a single month than Germany produced in an entire year. This was not a war between armies. This was a war between industrial philosophies. And one philosophy was being crushed under the weight of the other. The technical manuals told this story in quiet detail. The German Kraftfahrzeug manual for the Type 82 was concise, focused on field repairs, how to adjust the limited slip differential, how to clean the air-cooled engine, how to conserve fuel, how to keep the vehicle running when spare parts were unavailable. Every page assumed scarcity. The American TM 9-803 series was different, massive, comprehensive, hundreds of pages, detailing not just repairs but complete overhauls. How to replace an entire engine in field conditions, how to swap transmissions, how to install new axles. The manual assumed that if something broke, you had the replacement ready. It assumed abundance. German engineers who studied these manuals understood the implications immediately. The Jeep was not designed to last forever. It was designed to last long enough for the supply chain to deliver a replacement part or an entirely new vehicle. The Americans had built their entire military logistics around the assumption that production would always outpace destruction. And they were right. In the summer of 1944, the disparity became visible on a massive scale. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, brought this industrial reality to Europe's doorstep. On June 6th, Allied forces landed on 5 beaches. Within hours, jeeps were rolling off landing craft onto French soil. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Each infantry division was authorized 149 jeeps. Armored divisions had more. Artillery units needed them for towing guns and hauling ammunition. Medical units converted them into ambulances. Communications teams used them to lay telephone cable. Engineers mounted them with arc welders and cable spools. The jeep filled every role, adapted to every need. German defenders watched this invasion fleet with growing alarm. Vehicles poured ashore in an endless stream. When German artillery destroyed a convoy, another appeared within hours. The beaches became parking lots of American equipment waiting to move inland. And still more ships arrived. For German soldiers who had spent years fighting with inadequate supplies, this abundance was psychologically devastating. They were not losing to better soldiers or superior tactics. They were losing to a nation that could afford to waste resources. That could leave damaged vehicles abandoned on roadsides because replacing them was easier than repairing them. That treated a $2,000 Jeep as disposable. Wehrmacht General Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, reportedly said after the war that the Jeep was one of the 3 pieces of American equipment that most impressed him. Not the Sherman tank, not the P-51 fighter. The Jeep, because it represented something tanks and planes did not. It represented the assumption of infinite supply. By August 1944, as Allied forces broke out from Normandy and swept across France, the Jeep became the symbol of liberation. French civilians lined roads waving at passing American convoys. The distinctive flat hood and round headlights became instantly recognizable. Children ran alongside shouting, "Jeep! Jeep!" Soldiers tossed candy and cigarettes from the vehicles as they passed. But for German soldiers retreating eastward, the sight of those same jeeps was ominous. They appeared everywhere, on every road. In every captured town, moving supplies forward, evacuating wounded, carrying officers to forward positions, the Americans moved faster, supplied better, and maintained mobility that German forces could not match. German logisticians tried to calculate how the Americans maintained such operations. The fuel alone seemed impossible. Each jeep consumed roughly 1 gallon per 20 miles. Multiply that by tens of thousands of vehicles operating simultaneously across France. The fuel requirements were astronomical, yet the Americans never seemed to run short. The answer lay in a supply system, German. Planners had never imagined building. The Red Ball Express, an emergency logistics operation, moved supplies from Normandy beaches to frontline units. Hundreds of trucks ran 24 hours a day on one-way routes. They carried fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts forward. They rarely returned empty, bringing damaged equipment back for salvage. And at the center of this system, coordinating movements, delivering orders, evacuating casualties, was the Jeep. It was not the biggest vehicle, not the most heavily armed, but it was everywhere, indispensable. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In December 1944, Hitler launched his final major offensive in the West. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last attempt to split Allied forces and force a negotiated peace. Among the units tasked with this desperate gamble was Panzer Brigade 150, commanded by SS Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny's mission was unique. His brigade would not fight conventionally. Instead, German soldiers, fluent in English, would wear captured American uniforms, drive captured American vehicles, and infiltrate behind Allied lines. Their objective was to seize bridges over the Meuse River before the Americans could destroy them. The operation was named Unternehmen Greif, Operation Griffin. And at its center were captured American jeeps. The plan required 100 jeeps. Wehrmacht headquarters scoured occupied territories for captured vehicles. They found 30. The remaining vehicles were German Kübelwagens, hastily painted olive drab with American markings applied. The disguise was crude, but from a distance might work. Skorzeny drilled his men on American procedures: how to salute, how to speak, how to behave at checkpoints. But he made a critical error. He assumed American jeeps operated like German Kübelwagens. The Type 82 seated 4 and typically carried 4 soldiers. The jeep also seated 4. Therefore, Skorzeny concluded, American jeeps must also carry 4 men. He was wrong. American practice assigned 2 soldiers to a jeep, occasionally 3. 4 was abnormal, highly unusual. When the offensive began and Allied forces learned of German infiltrators wearing American uniforms, they established a simple rule. Any jeep carrying 4 men was to be stopped and its occupants questioned. If they hesitated, shoot first. Skorzeny's operation failed completely. Not a single objective bridge was captured. Some of his teams were killed at checkpoints. Others were caught behind Allied lines and executed as spies. The failure had many causes, but one contributing factor was simple. Skorzeny did not understand how Americans used their own vehicle. This misunderstanding was telling. German officers had studied captured jeeps. They had translated technical manuals. They understood the mechanical systems. But they did not understand the operational philosophy behind the vehicle. They saw a machine. Americans saw a tool integrated into a larger system of abundance and mobility. The Battle of the Bulge revealed this gap in stark terms. German forces advanced with vehicles carefully rationed. Fuel was scarce, replacement parts non-existent. When a Kübelwagen broke down, it was abandoned. When a captured American vehicle ran out of fuel, it was left behind. German mobility depended on capturing American supplies, but those supplies were never where German planners expected them to be. Meanwhile, American forces, despite being caught by surprise, reorganized with remarkable speed. Jeeps evacuated forward positions under fire. They carried ammunition to besieged units at Bastogne. They towed anti-tank guns into position along the shoulders of the German advance. When roads were cut, Jeeps found alternate routes. When bridges were destroyed, engineers used them to haul Bailey Bridge components forward. The Americans lost ground initially, but they never lost mobility. And in modern warfare, mobility meant everything. By January 1945, the German offensive had collapsed. Wehrmacht forces retreated, leaving behind hundreds of destroyed vehicles. Among them were many captured American Jeeps, abandoned when fuel ran out or mechanical problems arose that German mechanics could not fix without spare parts. American recovery teams moved forward, salvaging what they could. Damaged Jeeps were evaluated. If repairable, they were sent to rear maintenance depots. If too badly damaged, they were stripped for parts. Nothing was wasted. The system kept flowing. Production continued. Supply lines remained intact. For German engineers examining captured vehicles and manuals in early 1945, the conclusion was inescapable. They had designed vehicles for a world of limited resources. The Americans had designed vehicles for a world of unlimited production. Both approaches were rational. Both reflected their nation's capabilities. But only one could win a global industrial war. The Kübelwagen was an excellent vehicle for what Germany could build. Light, efficient, cleverly engineered to overcome limitations. It served well in every theatre of war. German soldiers trusted it. Officers appreciated its reliability under harsh conditions. If the war had been shorter, if resources had been more available, the Kübelwagen might have been sufficient. But the war was not short. Resources grew scarcer every month, and the American Jeep kept arriving, in endless convoys, carried by endless fleets of ships, produced by factories that never stopped running, supported by a supply system designed around the assumption that there would always be more. The technical manuals told this story without words. The American manual taught replacement. One assumed scarcity, the other assumed abundance. And in the arithmetic of total war, abundance multiplied by industrial capacity always defeated cleverness multiplied by constraint. By February 1945, the outcome was certain. Germany's industrial base was collapsing under Allied bombing. Factories were destroyed or lacked raw materials. Transportation networks were shattered. Fuel production had nearly ceased. The Kübelwagen production line at Wolfsburg fell silent. The 50,435th and final vehicle rolled out in March 1945. In Detroit and Toledo, production continued. In April 1945 alone, American factories produced more than 30,000 Jeeps. The assembly lines ran without pause. Workers continued their 3 shifts. Ships continued loading vehicles for transport to Europe and the Pacific. The system that had been built assumed the war would continue. It assumed demand would never stop. It assumed abundance was permanent. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, hundreds of thousands of Jeeps were scattered across Europe. In cities and towns newly liberated, in forward supply depots, in maintenance yards, on roads and in fields, they had become as common as the landscape itself. German soldiers walking away from the war passed columns of abandoned American vehicles. Some Jeeps sat perfectly intact, simply out of fuel, or awaiting minor repairs that never came. Others were damaged but still recognizable. To the defeated Wehrmacht troops, these vehicles represented everything they had faced. Not just machines, but the industrial power of a nation that could afford to leave thousands of dollars worth of equipment sitting unused, because bringing them home cost more than building new ones. In the occupation zones that followed Germany's surrender, Allied forces continued using their Jeeps. British troops drove them through bombed-out Berlin. American military police used them to patrol checkpoints. French units employed them for liaison work. Soviet soldiers, who had received nearly 32,000 Jeeps through Lend-Lease during the war, kept them in service for years afterward. The British Army, despite their engineers' dismissive report about the Kübelwagen, found themselves in control of the Volkswagen factory at Wolfsburg. They ordered the plant to resume production, not of Kübelwagens but of civilian Beetles. By the end of 1945, workers had assembled 2,490 vehicles. Many were immediately traded to farmers and merchants in exchange for food and raw materials. The factory that had built Germany's answer to the Jeep now built cars to feed its workers. Meanwhile, The Volkswagen Type 82 Kübelwagen itself disappeared from military service. A few survived in private hands, kept by collectors or soldiers who had developed affection for the vehicle. Some were converted for agricultural use. Others were simply scrapped, their steel reclaimed for reconstruction. 1950. The Kübelwagen was already becoming a memory, a relic of a defeated military system. The American Jeep followed a different path. Willis Overland recognized immediately that the vehicle had commercial potential. In late 1945, they introduced the CJ2A, the first civilian Jeep. It looked nearly identical to its military predecessor. Flat hood, round headlights, four-wheel drive. But it was marketed for farms, construction sites, and rural communities rather than battlefields. Farmers embraced it. The Jeep could plow fields, haul equipment, traverse muddy tracks that would stop conventional trucks. Construction crews used it to reach remote job sites. Surveyors drove it into wilderness areas. The same capabilities that made it valuable in war made it indispensable in peace. And because Willis had already built the production infrastructure, civilian Jeeps rolled off assembly lines at remarkable speed and low cost. But the military kept buying them too. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, required vehicles for another conflict. The same Jeeps that had served in Europe and the Pacific now deployed to the frozen mountains and muddy valleys of Korea. American forces, British Commonwealth troops, and South Korean units all relied on them. The design barely changed. Why modify what already worked? In military circles worldwide, the lessons of World War II were being absorbed and codified. The Jeep's success spawned imitations. Land Rover in Britain developed their Series 1, heavily influenced by Jeeps left behind after the war. The Soviet Union created the GAZ-67, clearly inspired by American design. France produced the Delahaye VLR. Japan built the Toyota Land Cruiser. Every nation that had witnessed American logistics in action wanted their own version of that mobility. But building vehicles was only half the equation. The real lesson, the one many nations struggled to implement, was the system behind the vehicle, the supply chains, the standardized parts, the maintenance doctrine built around replacement rather than repair, the assumption that production capacity could overwhelm battlefield losses. This was harder to copy than a machine. It required a complete transformation of military logistics and industrial planning. The United States Army continued refining the concept. The M38 Willis replaced the MB in 1949 with improved engine and updated components. The M38A1 followed in 1952 with better ergonomics. Finally, in 1960, Ford introduced the M151, a complete redesign that served until the 1980s. Each iteration maintained the core philosophy: simple, reliable, easy to maintain, designed for replacement. The Jeep's influence extended beyond military circles. By the 1960s, recreational off-roading had become popular in the United States. Enthusiasts bought surplus military Jeeps, modified them, and drove them into deserts and mountains for sport. The vehicle that had carried soldiers through war now carried families through wilderness. Willis, and later American Motors Corporation, capitalized on this by producing civilian models specifically for recreation. The CJ series evolved through multiple generations: CJ5, CJ7. Eventually, the Wrangler. Each retained design elements from the original Willis MB: the flat hood, the vertical grille, the removable doors and fold-down windshield. These were not just styling choices, they were deliberate connections to heritage. The Jeep's reputation had been forged in war. Its peacetime success traded on that reputation. But the deeper legacy was less visible. In military academies and logistics schools, instructors taught the lessons of World War II supply chains. They showed students photographs of Red Ball Express convoys. They assigned case studies about the fuel requirements for Operation Overlord. They asked questions about industrial mobilization and standardization. And inevitably, they discussed the Jeep, not as a vehicle, as a philosophy. The American approach to military logistics, born from abundance and confidence in industrial capacity, had proven decisive. This approach assumed that production would always outpace consumption, that supply lines could be maintained over vast distances, that standardization enabled rapid deployment and maintenance. These assumptions had been proven correct in 1941 through 1945. They became doctrine. German military analysts, writing in the decades after the war, acknowledged this reality. They had lost not because their soldiers lacked courage or their weapons lacked quality. They lost because they could not match Allied production. Every memoir, every analysis, every historical study reached the same conclusion. Industrial capacity decided the war, and the Jeep, more than any other single item, symbolized that capacity. Wehrmacht General Fritz Bayerlein, who had commanded Panzer Lehr Division in Normandy, said in post-war interviews that American logistics were unlike anything Germany could have created. He specifically mentioned the Jeep's ubiquity. Everywhere his troops looked, there were American vehicles. Destroyed one day, replaced the next. This created a sense of futility that undermined German morale more effectively than any battle. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, when asked what weapon he feared most, reportedly answered without hesitation, the Jeep, not the Sherman tank, despite its numbers, not the P-51 fighter, despite its dominance of the skies. The Jeep, because it represented American logistical superiority, the ability to move supplies, evacuate wounded, position artillery, and coordinate attacks across hundreds of miles of front. These German officers understood what many historians would later articulate. World War II was not decided by dramatic technological breakthroughs. The atomic bomb ended the Pacific War but did not determine its outcome. Radar and code breaking provided advantages but did not guarantee victory. What determined the war was the grinding reality of industrial production, steel tonnage, vehicle output, supply ship capacity, the unglamorous mathematics of logistics. And in that mathematics, the Jeep was a fundamental unit, a baseline measurement of mobility, 637,770 units produced, each one a small piece of a vast system designed to project power across oceans and continents. Each one a statement that America possessed resources its enemies could not hope to match. The captured German technical manuals sitting in American archives told a parallel story. The Kübelwagen manual was a masterpiece of efficiency, every page optimized for field conditions, every diagram clear and practical. It taught soldiers to care for a vehicle designed to last despite shortages of fuel, parts, and maintenance facilities. It was exactly what Germany needed, and it was not nearly enough. The American manuals were different, bulky, comprehensive, almost wasteful in their detail. They assumed readers had access to complete workshops, full inventories of spare parts, and unlimited time for maintenance. They taught replacement, not conservation. They reflected a nation that could afford to be generous with information because it could afford to be generous with everything. When German engineers first studied these American manuals in 1943 and 44, they saw a mirror. Their own philosophy reflected back at them in negative. Where they designed for scarcity, Americans designed for abundance. Where they emphasized repair, Americans emphasized replacement. Where they conserved, Americans consumed. Neither approach was inherently superior in abstract terms. But in total war, one approach could field millions of vehicles, while the other struggled to maintain 50,000. This was the revelation that came too late to change anything. By the time German technical experts fully understood American logistics, the war's outcome was already certain. The Jeep manuals were not secret documents revealing hidden technology. They were open declarations of industrial philosophy. And that philosophy, more than any weapon, more than any tactic, determined who would win. In the decades after 1945, the Jeep became an icon. It appeared in films about the war. The Longest Day, Patton, Band of Brothers, always recognizable, always evoking a specific moment in history. Veterans who had driven them during the war bought civilian versions afterward, maintaining connections to their service. Jeep owners formed clubs, restored vintage models, attended rallies where they could see hundreds of these vehicles gathered together. But beyond nostalgia and popular culture, the Jeep's legacy lived on in military doctrine. Every modern army studied World War II logistics. They examined how the Allies maintained supply lines across the Atlantic and Pacific. They analyzed how standardization enabled rapid deployment. They learned that mobility and supply capacity often mattered more than firepower. And in every case, the Jeep served as a case study, a single vehicle that embodied an entire approach to war. The Kübelwagen, by contrast, faded from memory. Excellent vehicle though it was, it represented a philosophy that had failed. Design for scarcity, conserve resources, make do with less. These were admirable engineering principles. In peacetime, in conditions of limited resources, they made perfect sense. But in industrial total war, they led to defeat. No amount of cleverness could overcome insufficient production capacity. No engineering elegance could substitute for abundant supply. This was the uncomfortable truth both vehicles revealed. Germany and the United States entered World War II with different assumptions about resources and production. Germany assumed constraints. America assumed abundance. Both nations built vehicles that reflected these assumptions. Both vehicles performed well within their design parameters, but the parameters themselves determined the outcome. When the last Kübelwagen was built in March 1945, Germany had produced 50,435 vehicles over 5 years. When American Jeep production finally ended in 1945, 637,770 had been built in just 4 years. The disparity told the entire story. Germany could not build enough. America built more than enough. And then kept building. The captured manuals, sitting in archives on both sides of the Atlantic, documented this disparity in technical detail. They showed not just how vehicles worked, but how nations thought about war. The German manual assumed readers would face shortages and must improvise. The American manual assumed readers would have everything they needed and must simply follow procedures. One assumption led to defeat, the other to victory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.